Today's convocation is described as controlling what we own, shifting power. When the concentration of power is so egregiously placed in the hands of the few, deciding for the many, which are often called plutocracies merging with oligarchs, that is, the very rich connecting with the very powerful political forces to establish a corporate state, often described as Wall Street merging with Washington. When that happens, we have to shift power if we're going to survive as a practicing democracy. And shifting power is a many-faceted exercise. We can do it through electoral reforms. We can do it through judicial actions. We can do it through many other ways of public expression and determination, fostering a government of the people, by the people, for the people at the federal, state, and local level. But today we're going to focus on two categories of assets. The greatest pool of capital in the United States is owned by the people. It's owned by workers, it's owned by investors, it's owned by shareholders. These are the giant pension funds, the giant mutual funds, the endowments, and of course, individual savers and investors. They have placed these gigantic pools of assets, which own 74% of the stock of the New York Stock Exchange companies. 74%. They have placed these assets in the hands of brokers and investment analysts and other parts of the investment world as a trusteeship. Those who are investing on behalf of pension funds, mutual funds, are supposed to have a fiduciary duty. Unfortunately, these enormous instruments of leverage on major corporations, which could control those corporations, decide who's on the board of directors, who's the president, who's the CEO, what the policies are, have been released over time, increasingly complex ways, to a very small number of brokerage firms, banks, insurance companies, and other alleged trustees that have not been fulfilling their fiduciary purposes. The second category is what is called the commons. And that's more of the physical assets, the natural assets. In a wonderful book called Alternatives to Economic Globalization, A Better World is Possible, that came out about 20 years ago, and it could have been written today, such as the overwhelming manifestation of stasis, or lack of change. There's a section called Understanding the Commons, and I want to quote briefly. Some commons may be thought of as global, such as the atmosphere, the oceans, outer space, and because they have no territorial claimants, Antarctica and the moon. Others may be thought of as community commons, public spaces, common lands, forests, the gene pool, local innovative knowledge with respect to medicinal plants, and seeds that communities have developed over centuries. Author Jonathan Rowe of California's Tomales Bay Institute points out that the key characteristics of all aspects of the commons is that they belong to everyone. No one has traditionally had exclusive rights to them. We have inherited them jointly. They are our common heritage. They are more basic to our lives than the state or the market, says Rowe. He goes on to say, quote, "One cannot imagine a life without air fit to breathe, oceans rich with life, free clean water, a vibrant biodiversity. These are the things we have always taken for granted. The commons have the quality of always having been there, one generation after another, available forever to all. There is another category, the modern commons of public services like health, water purification, distribution, education, information, each of which was once achieved informally within small local and indigenous communities that have since been absorbed by the state or are also now on tap for privatization. That's the movement to take over the commons. I like to call it corporatization. They want to, for example, control local drinking water sources and administration. They want to buy up municipal drinking water. Who's they? It's corporations. So I would prefer to use the word corporatization. It's important to note that this day is going to be produced by real networks of, This day will be produced by Real News Networks in Baltimore, and it's going to be used in the future for all kinds of seminars, educational forums, civic assemblies. And so we can consider that you who have turned out our studio audience, and thank you for turning out. Democracy is all about power, isn't it? It's sharing power, using power, deconcentrating power, channeling power for the common good. And part of it is paying attention to our principal democratic assets, and those are the pools of capital and the commons. And if we shift power by developing mechanisms to control what we own and not have corporations control what we own and use the government to ensure corporate control, then obviously a lot of benefits can flow. Yesterday, Mitch Rofsky noted that the Alaska Permanent Fund, which receives income from oil in Alaska, which is owned by the state of Alaska, has distributed as much as $2,000 a year to every man, woman, and child in Alaska. It's down a bit because the oil prices are down. But still, it's a good example of creating a commons. Early on, when the East India Company thought it owned most of India, and the Hudson Bay Company thought it owned a lot of Canada, the early crown corporations of the British Empire wanted ownership. And the early decades of the new country, United States of America, the theme of corporations was to own things. But they confronted pushback. Labor organized, farmers organized, and the people developed assets of their own. They developed pensions, they developed savings, they owned stock. Along came the mutual funds and the pension funds. And we have the U.S. Forest Service, Department of Interior, Department of Agriculture, Bureau of Land Reclamation. And the amount of land owned by the U.S. government in trustee for us and posterity, if you add onshore, it's 1/3 of America. If you add offshore, it more than doubles that. Lots of resources there: timber, grazing, hard rock minerals, gold, silver, molybdenum, oil, gas, coal, uranium, and these have been held in trusteeship by U.S. government agencies. So over 100 years ago, some very smart corporate lawyers, and we should never lose our focus on these corporate attorneys and these giant corporate law firms. We've written books on them. They are the architects of corporate power. They are the brains of corporate power. When executives go to these law firms like Cahill Gordon and Cravath Swaine and Covington and Burling, they basically say, here's what we want to do. We want to control this. We want to make this kind of profit. We want to pay minimal taxes. We want to pit one country against another for maximizing our sales and profits and tax escapes. Show us how to do it. And some of the most brilliant intellectual work in American history has come from these law schools, these law firms, fed by prominent law schools like Harvard and Yale, Columbia. And this brilliance has led to the corporate state. It has built and entrenched the power radiating throughout the land of the plutocracy and the oligarchy. This is why we have to pay attention to this critical day. Never in American history have more accomplished scholars, teachers, and practitioners been brought together on this theme of turning commonly owned assets into the common good in one day. That's how undeveloped our democratic society is. We're talking here of trillions and trillions and trillions of dollars of capital and natural resource assets, incalculable, owned by the people, controlled by the corporations, using the arm of our own government against us. For decades, for example, magnificent trees in the national forest were cut down by private timber companies using taxpayer-built roads in the national forest and getting them for the price of a cheeseburger. Magnificent trees in the Tongass forest in Alaska, for example. They're paying a little more now for it. But the National Forest Service is losing money. That means the taxpayers are subsidizing often the clear cutting of these forests against the judgment of the foresters of the National Forest Service, who over 20 years ago started their own public interest group called PEER, PEER.org, to protect their intellectual and professional integrity when they say that these areas should not be clear-cutted, there is soil erosion, there's silt, there's water contamination. You might want to go and see their website. It's a magnificent nonprofit group called PEER, and the website is PEER.org. Now, as I said yesterday, we've reached a point in our democracy where our commercial elections have put democracy off limits. And that spells out in today's context as the elections are not talking about this. The candidates are not talking about this. To the extent that they are in the West, they are right-wing Republicans who want to corporatize federal land, or at least give it to the states so they can be more subservient to the corporate natural resource extractive industries. Today we're going to be treated with introductions by Knut Rostad, who has headed a financial fiduciary institute and has done a lot of work with people on controlling what stockholders own by stockholders, investor Rights. He's president of the Institute for the Fiduciary Standard. He's over here, and he'll be the moderator. But think of the brain power and the moral power that's going to be here today. There's Dennis Kelleher about reinvigorating the Securities Exchange Commission. He is a very broad-gauged advocate. There's Ray Rogers, who led the way in corporate campaigns on behalf of labor unions, for example, environmental groups. He knows how to work the interstices of corporate boards of directors, interlocking directorates, and other levers on corporations. There's William Lazanik, who is a critic of stock buybacks and executive pay. Stock buybacks are hundreds of billions of dollars in a decade, even more. And it's like burning money, except that it increases the likelihood of higher pay for the executives. And to give you an example, Walmart has bought back over $50 billion of stock in the last few years, and it has refused to give its workers a living wage. They are in effect spending the consumers' dollars to buy back their stock on behalf of the Walton family, which is the biggest shareholder, and fighting tooth and nail over 1 million workers who are desperately trying to support their family. They have finally raised their wages to just under $10 an hour. But for years and years, they were paying over 1 million workers less than Walmart workers got in 1968 adjusted for inflation. Less than what Walmart workers got in 1968 adjusted for inflation. And they still are, because they would have to pay $11.60 an hour if the minimum wage was adjusted for inflation. At the same time, the CEO of Walmart is making $11,000 an hour, 8 hours a day, plus benefits. Stock buybacks are the big story today in the misbehavior of giant corporations with the consumers' dollars. You'll hear about that. You'll also hear a statement that Mr. Rosted will read on behalf of Robert Monks, who couldn't make it today. From Maine, he's a multimillionaire and leading advocate for shareholder rights and a very progressive author. You'll hear from Jeffrey Clements, who I think has written the best book on corporations are not people for the average reader. You'll hear from him on the perils of corporate personhood. You'll hear from Sean McKessie, who just left the SEC's whistleblowing office, which gives successful whistleblowers a bounty, and he's now in a whistleblowing firm, and he'll talk about blowing the whistle on securities fraud. You'll then hear from Rob Magera from the AFL-CIO, whose staff should be here in great numbers, but are not, on shareholder resolutions for justice and what the AFL-CIO has done and other labor unions have done in that area. You'll hear from Lloyd Constantine, a very successful litigator, with ways that shareholders can be organized so they can have their own staff and ride herd on their corporations. After lunch, you'll hear from the great John Bogle, who innovated mutual funds coming out of his senior thesis at Princeton. He actually wrote a senior thesis and put it into practice. Started the Vanguard Fund, which is a mutual fund, mutually owned, and it is the largest mutual fund in the United States. And he also has other missions that he will talk to you about in some detail. William Lirac, who was the leading litigator against corporate fraud, and he will talk about curbing abuse of shareholders through litigation. And then will come Maria Glover, professor at Georgetown. Her topic will be private enforcement, myth or reality. And then arguably the nation's expert on the commons, David Bollier from Amherst, Massachusetts, will be here. He's written many books, and one of them was designed for a quick read. It's called Thinking Like a Commoner. And you'll see what he's been doing all over the world with his colleagues in reviving the awareness and advocacy for protecting all kinds of commonly owned property and resources. And then you'll hear from William Black, Professor William Black, who's had a lot of government experience in banking area, and he's talking about turning the lights out on major financial fraud. Professor Lynn Stout could not be with us from Cornell. She's come down with a virus, but she may be submitting a statement on the real purposes of public corporations. And then we'll have a treat listening to Ellen Brown on public banking. If we have all these commonly pooled assets, pensions, and all the money that's being put into Wall Street firms, why not put it into public banks? Apropos the Bank of North Dakota, which has been extremely successful, stable, and honest, and avoided completely the collapse of the banking industry during the Wall Street crash. And then we'll have audience participation and questions. If you write out your questions, we can discuss it. And this evening, we have the annual Callaway Moral Courage Awards that are presented by Dr. Claire Nader, and you will see two public servants of great courage being celebrated and giving their explanation of why they did that in terms of nuclear energy and aviation safety. So with that, we will concentrate on how we can turn community assets or commonly owned assets or capital pools of gigantic dimensions into the common good in order to shift power from the few to the many, starting with what we already own, which I think is a pretty good start. We don't have to clamor for it. We already own it. And we got to put muscle behind the drive to control what we own.
Years ago, a fellow Vista volunteer said, "It's the sharing or balancing of power that life is all about. For where power is lacking, so are hope and happiness." That's why I want to applaud Ralph and all others who have taken up the fight to challenge the concentration and abuse of power by corporations whose unbridled greed is destroying our democracy and the very fabric of our society. Now, the late columnist Ann Landers once said, "The Lord gave us two ends, one to think with and the other to sit on, and our success will depend upon which end we use the most. If we are to be successful in challenging the abuse of corporate power, we must use our heads, think strategically, and fight smart." That means that we must get off our butts, seize the initiative, and confront power with power. The great late organizer and author of Rules for Radicals and Reveille for Radicals, Saul Alinsky, was working with poor people in the ghettos of Chicago. They were so frustrated and angry and depressed because they couldn't get City Hall to listen to their concerns. And the concerns were that there were rats had infested their communities and were overrunning their homes. And the city council had money for rat eradication programs, but they wouldn't free up the money. So Saul said, "Listen, you've got your imaginations, And whatever you have around you, start thinking, how can you build political power? How can you deal with this terrible situation? The City Hall is ignoring you. So the residents of the ghetto got a few of their beat-up old trucks, filled the trucks with hundreds of rats, drove over to City Hall, and let them go. Well, guess what? City Hall freed up the funds for rat eradication programs the next day. What did Saul Alinsky and the residents of the ghetto in Chicago teach us? They taught us that if we have a serious problem, make your problem the problem of those individuals and institutions that have the power to immediately solve it. Now, I've been involved in many labor struggles, and I've gone into situations time and again where all the power was on the side of management, both in the private and public sector. The union was on the bottom rung of the ladder of power. Management was at the top. And before we were done with our corporate campaign strategy, the ladder of power was completely overturned, and the workers won these humongous victories. You know, I've said to workers, listen, you have a lot more power than simply withholding your labor. There's a great deal of power in the collective mobilization. There's a great deal of power in building broad-based coalitions and in a collective mobilization and strategic deployment of workers' energies, their bank accounts, their insurance policies, their stock proxies, their pension investments, their purchasing power, and their votes. And there's also a great deal of power in the collective mobilization and strategic deployment of workers' knowledge, imaginations, and skills. You know, you heard of the Verizon strike every few years. You've heard of other big strikes. Let me tell you right now, if labor leaders were doing their job and they understand the corporate strategy, there'd be far fewer strikes and far fewer lockouts. A lockout being a reverse strike where management says, you won't give in to our demands, we're going to stick you in the street and starve you into submission. We told workers long ago, and how I backed these corporations down when I've been involved. Corporations, a big utility company, said to 1,800 union members in New York City, if you don't give in to our demands, we're going to lock 1,800 of you out. The union leadership says we couldn't stand another lockout for months as we have in the past. So I says, give me the biggest room possible, get it as close to the corporate headquarters of Brooklyn Union Gas as possible, and I'm going to address the crowd. And I know that somebody from the union, from the company will be there. I want them to hear what I got to say, and I want your members to hear what I got to say. After I got done with my presentation, which my message was, you lock 1,800 of these workers out, and we're going to turn them into such a force. We're going to tell them we want you to work 30, 40, or 50 hours a week, fighting the company around a real strategy. We're going to build power, and we're going to divide and conquer that company. So they knew that if they were to lock those workers out, we're going to put up a few pickets, sure, but we're headed out to these areas where we're going to take you head on, where we know you're vulnerable. Within 15 days, what the union couldn't handle, the company caved in and took every demand for concessions off the table. I did the same thing with public transit workers in New York. All right, when you get involved in public sector fights, you also have to look at the private sector. We backed down real conservative, nasty Republican politicians by the name of George Pataki and Rudy Giuliani, where the workers who they felt didn't have a chance to fight the power that they were up against, the political and economic power. The New York Times reported they won the best contract in 10 years, the highest raises, and got all the concessions off the table. It was a campaign that I developed. And what was the campaign around? We want our fair share, not a fair hike. We got the public on our side. We want our fair share, not a fair hike. Secondly, where are we going to get the money for the transit workers? We're going to get it from take back all the corporate welfare you're giving all the big corporations. We handed out 500,000, the workers, we put together 500,000 brochures. While you are swiping your card, others are swiping billions, and public transit suffers. Giuliani and Pataki woke up so fast they called the union. We won this historic victory for the public sector workers. That's about turning the ladder of power around. I've also said to workers, look, Your struggle isn't just against one entity, Corporation X. Your struggle is against a coalition of very powerful economic and political interests that can be challenged, attacked, divided, and conquered. I've also said to workers that you cannot confront powerful adversaries and expect to gain any meaningful concessions or justice unless you are backed by a significant force of power yourself. A corporate campaign, above all, is not just a campaign against a corporation. It's a well-defined, well-researched, well-thought-out strategy. But above all, a corporate campaign is a mechanism to confront power with power. Remember that. When I see people's strategies, one demonstration after another, one protest after another, with no real concept of what it's going to take to win, when I lay out a strategy, I want to know. I deal with a conceptual problem based on in-depth research and a specialized corporate, financial, political power analysis. I want to know that if I can carry this strategy out, I, damn it, will win. No question about it. And the only way, though, that I can win is I have to now deal with not just the conceptual problem. I got the winning strategy. Now I got to deal with the organizational problem. Do I have the resources and organizational know-how to implement that strategy to its final conclusion of victory? Now let's take a look at when the first corporate campaign was developed, which I did to take on this nasty textile company called J.P. Stevens, on which the film Norma Ray was based. First, I said to the union, you cannot look at J.P. Stevens as 85 plants, 45,000 employees, and a big multinational corporation with endless Wall Street connections. If you look at it that way, it becomes too unmanageable to deal with. Instead, look at it as the 13 men, and yes, they were all men at that time. Look at it as the 13 men, the top policymakers who are on the board of directors. Now we bring it down to a manageable size. What are some of the things we did? I said, well, first of all, we're going to make the annual meeting of battlegrounds every year. The year before I got involved, the union had 30 people demonstrating at the annual meeting. I said, that makes the union look weak. The annual meeting will be part of my corporate campaign strategy. So the next year, the person who hired me bet me $1. On a Tuesday afternoon at Stevens' annual meeting, I couldn't get 200 people out there demonstrating. I had between 4,000 and 5,000 people march and surround J.P. Stevens' headquarters in New York City. But you want to know what? I had 600 people lined up an hour before with stock proxies in hand because I had organized over 600 individuals and organizations to buy 1 share of stock in the company. Why? I wanted to march into that meeting with power in numbers. All right? And I wanted to intimidate those corporate executives and board members the way that they'd been intimidating these textile workers all these years. And I wanted to display my power in numbers. And I wanted to leave a message with all the people at the annual meeting representing Wall Street that anybody supportive of this J.P. Stevens company and the horrible way that they treat the workers is going to be held accountable. Stevens moved this annual meeting out of New York City for the first time in over 100 years and never came back. We followed him down south. Every year it became a battlegrounds. I then set my sights on some of the power structure, the web of power behind J.P. Stevens. I decided to take on Manufacturers Hanover Bank, the 4th largest bank in the country. Why? 2 of Stevens' directors, including its chief executive, were on the board of Manufacturers Hanover. It also lent money to the Stevens company and held stock. Big headlines, 1978, New York Times and Wall Street Journal. 2 of Stevens' top policymakers forced to resign from Manufacturers Hanover Bank. I took 150 people into that annual meeting of Manufacturers Hanover Bank, and we raised hell. And I had union leaders stand up about the pension funds they represented, the defense funds they represented, all the members they represented that had money at Manufacturers Hanover. And then I reached out and created a lot of friction with the labor movement in Manufacturers Hanover. The next thing you knew, the Manufacturers Hanover were getting letters. I gathered up these letters and took them to Newsweek. The next thing, Newsweek was reporting that Manufacturers Hanover was facing a $1 billion pullout of union funds. Wham! 2 top officials. Oh, microphone, tap, tap. It worked for Ralph, now it works for me. All right, so I got down to Manufacturers Hanover. What happened a couple of weeks later? The CEO of Avon Products resigned from the board of J.P. Stevens. This is unprecedented wielding of power. The country had never seen anything like this. It was all something that was created out of my head, because I learned a lot of things from other good people like yourselves and got a lot of experience and came up with these organizational concepts. The head of Avon resigns. Again, big news. How did that happen? Women back there in 1978 were holding this huge conference in, I think it was down in Texas. And I had a minister, two women, a minister who was a woman, and a nun who were working on the campaign, on the boycott aspect of it. And they were down in Houston at this women's conference. I said, listen, you got to do me a favor. You've got to get as many of the leaders of women's groups down there to send a wire, a telegram to the head of Avon. And here's a bunch of postcards. Get as many of these women down here to sign these postcards and send them in Avon. They got 1,100 postcards signed, got them sent in Avon. They got these telegrams going to Avon, and the head of Avon resigns. Why? Because he realized that, hey, we need these women to like Avon. So we talked their language. We went to the heart of his self-interest. He resigns from J.P. Stevens. They can all sit on these boards. They can all cheer the corporation whose boards they sit on and get these big fees, as long as it's not affecting them. So I take the fight directly to them. I personalize the fight, and I take it right into their doorstep. I then went after what's called Siemens Bank for Savings. I didn't get the head of Siemens Bank for Savings to resign from the J.P. Stevens board, but what I did get him to do, this anti-union SOB, came to the union president and said, listen, I'm going to do everything I can to get this thing resolved. Why? Because we held a mile-long human billboard with people holding signs, break the J.P. Stevens Siemens Bank connection. We kept Siemens Bank from opening a new bank branch because we caught them on the redlining issue. We had legislation introduced to have depositors in savings banks elect the board of trustees, something the whole industry did not want. And then we had several hundred ministers of a church call for the resignation of the head of Siemens Bank from the church's pension fund. He was a force now within the board for change, so we had the pressure on him. Then I went after Sperry. Stevens' CEO was on the board of Sperry, as was Richard Shan. Oh no, I'm sorry, I missed one. I have to go back. Before Siemens, I went after New York Life Insurance Company. All right, and the CEO of New York Life and the CEO of J.P. Stevens sat on each other's board of directors. In the mutual insurance industry, I had said a few years back that was the key to breaking Stevens, because they controlled the long-term debt, and I got 3 minutes. Okay, let me put it this way. 24 hours after the head of New York Life said no such resignations will ever take place between New York Life and J.P. Stevens, they resigned from each other's boards. I took the real Norma Ray, Crystal Lee Sutton. I marched into the Sperry annual meeting. We didn't even have stock proxies, but I had a lot of people. We marched in with 700 people, led by the real Norma Ray, Crystal Lee Sutton. And as one union leader, Richard Wagner of the CWA, said, give the CEO of Sperry the Iron Bladder Award, because he stood up on that stage at that annual meeting for 5 hours and never went to the bathroom. How many of you are familiar with the horrible rainforest Chernobyl disaster, Chevron Texaco disaster? Because of all the toxic pollution that Chevron has left there and it's refused to clean up for decades. And they had a $9.5 billion judgment against them. And they've done everything to not pay or to clean up this mess. Let me just have a message for those of you who have done such great work and taken on Chevron. You need to understand the corporate campaign strategy, and here's a message, and I'm willing to talk to anybody who's representing that situation. I tried to get the government of Ecuador to sit down and talk with me with no success. I tried to get the lawyers to reach out to me and talk to me with no success. Let me just leave it here. If you want to turn Exxon around, and you want to win this thing, and you want to do it through a corporate campaign, understand one thing. At the heart of the corporate campaign, when you go after Exxon, you have to go after Wells Fargo Bank, the Coca-Cola Company, and Warren Buffett and Berkshire Hathaway. They're almost all one entity together. Chevron, Wells Fargo, the Coca-Cola Company, and Berkshire Hathaway. I see I got 1 minute left. All right, listen. The idea of a corporate campaign is this, and let me leave you with this. If you can't find a way and you're frustrated, damn it, you're going to make one. We'll either find a way or we'll make one. All right? So that's where I probably got 30 seconds. What could I use the next 30 seconds for? Just to say, listen, don't ever give up. These are not impenetrable bastions of power we're dealing with. As I said to a person once, a colleague of mine, when he said, we can never take on that big bank, force those resignations, and I said, Ed, the guy who's the head of that bank is about 5'6", weighs about 150 pounds. He wears a patch over his eye, okay? If he was on the street with us right now, either one of us could beat the hell out of him. And we can beat the hell out of this bank. Thank you very much.
Our next speaker, Dennis Kelleher, is President and Chief Executive Officer of Better Markets, a Washington, D.C.-based independent, nonpartisan, nonprofit organization that fights for a stable, balanced financial system that supports the real economy and rising living standards. Before Dennis took on this small challenge, he worked in several positions in the Senate and in law firms in financial regulatory issues. Now, what isn't said in his bio, but I think needs to be added, that if you look back for the last 8 years per se, for example, and looked at the strongest, most consistent voices of financial reform, two voices stand out, I think, in the media. One is Elizabeth Warren, and the second one is our next speaker.
Delighted to be discussing what we can do to reinvigorate the Securities and Exchange Commission, known as the SEC. Let me start with a warning. I'm a lawyer. I'm from Boston. I have a lot to say. I talk fast. First, before we talk about reinvigorating the SEC, what is the SEC? Why should anyone care about it? Does it need reinvigoration? And what can we do to reinvigorate it? The SEC was founded and created in the 1930s after the great stock market crash of 1929, which caused the Great Depression of the 1930s. Its purpose was to police the capital markets, make sure investors had accurate and complete information, and go after corporations, banks, and their executives that broke the law. Basically, they were supposed to prevent the rampant fraud that caused the stock market crash of 1929 and the Great Depression from ever happening again. The SEC's mission was and remains, first and foremost, to protect investors and markets, and that is especially important now that most of the stock market is made up of retirement accounts like your pensions and 401ks. It's also supposed to promote capital formation. That's just a fancy way of saying they're supposed to make sure there's enough capital, funds available for people to buy homes, pay for an education and retire, as well as for companies, small, medium, and large, to have enough capital to grow, expand, and hire people. As is obvious, those are really important missions, not only because investors should be protected, and not only because the market should be free of fraudsters and criminals, but because our families, businesses, economy, standard of living all depend on capital. And the majority of that comes from the capital markets, including prominently the stock markets. People must have faith, trust, and confidence in those markets, or they won't invest. And companies won't have the capital to grow and create jobs, and our standard of living will suffer. The SEC's job, basically, is to make sure that doesn't happen. So the SEC's job isn't just to protect investors and markets. It's also to protect your money, your savings, your retirement accounts, your standard of living, and your faith and confidence in our markets. It's a big job. Now let's take a look at what the SEC does or doesn't do. And let's start by talking about crime and punishment in corporate America, and in particular on Wall Street. We have cops on the city streets, and one way to think about the SEC is they're the cops on the Wall Street beat. And so how are they doing? Let's take an example from the headlines that a number of people have already referred to. By now, you've all heard or read about the Wells Fargo Bank. It's regrettable, but Wells Fargo is just the latest in a series, an endless series of outrageous scandals of illegal and criminal conduct on Wall Street and in corporate America. What's the Wells Fargo scandal all about? Well, like a street criminal, they stole money, and lots of it. But when it's a bank or a corporation, we don't really say steal. That's just not polite enough. Besides, if you say steal money, you might think they should be punished. Unlike a street criminal, Wells Fargo didn't do this by robbing you on the street. The people working at Wells Fargo stole your hard-earned money by using a computer to charge your accounts at the bank $25 here and $25 there. Or the bank wrongly charged you an account overdraft fee or bounce check fee. They took the money from your account and put it into the bank's account. But unlike a street crime, when Wells Fargo stole your money, it wasn't just one person at the bank stealing $25. It was actually thousands, maybe tens of thousands of people working at the bank that did the same thing or something very similar. They stole $25 over and over again from lots of their customers. While the details are different, it's important to remember that what a street criminal does when he robs somebody of their money and what these bank employees did is economically the same thing. They stole your money. You don't have it anymore. You had $25, they now have your $25. Make no mistake about it, this isn't a gray area. It's black and white. It's illegal criminal conduct, whether it's on the street or in the suites. But what Wells Fargo did was much, much worse in many ways. And stealing $25 here or there, over and over, they also falsified deposit account information, created fictitious deposit accounts, filled out false credit card applications for their customers who had no idea what was going on, created entire fictitious credit card accounts with passwords and everything else, PIN numbers. It's mind-boggling. Overall, they appeared to have forged millions of documents, which made the bank conveniently look like it had much more revenue and business activity than it did, which of course affects its stock price, which of course affects the capital markets and millions of investors who are buying and selling stock. Pretty bad stuff, but it gets worse. The thousands of Wells Fargo employees didn't just do this once. They didn't even just do it in 1 year. They did it over 5 years. 5 years by thousands of employees at a bank. This was a one-bank crime spree of enormous proportion. So what happened? Unbelievably, it takes a couple of years before anyone outside the bank even knows what's going on inside the bank. Remarkably, this massive, widespread, years-long illegal activity involving thousands of employees was discovered and revealed not by the cops, not by the Department of Justice, not by the FBI, goodness gracious, not by the SEC, not by other bank regulators, supposedly not even by the bank management, who had no idea what thousands and maybe tens of thousands of employees in the bank was doing for 5 years. No, it was discovered by an investigative reporter for the LA Times, who broke the story in December of 2013, almost 3 years ago. Well, of course, you all know what happened after this outrageous pattern of illegal conduct was splashed across the LA Times. The cops came, the FBI showed up, the SEC woke up, showed up, arrived. People were arrested, handcuffed, dragged off to jail. There were perp walks in front of the cameras. I'm sure you all remember that. They were punished. Executive lives were ruined. I know, don't laugh. None of that happened. In fact, not one of those things happened. In fact, to this day, the SEC is nowhere to be seen. You would think the agency whose job was to protect investors, markets, stop fraudulent and criminal conduct by public companies would be the first one on the scene. Not yet, but it's only been 3 years since the LA Times broke the story. So what really happened? Well, the LA District Attorney Office and the new Consumer Financial Protection Bureau, the CFPB, which was just created a few years ago, investigated Wells Fargo, which settled on September 8th of this year. What were the terms of the settlement for this outrageous, flagrant, 5-year-long illegal practice conducted by thousands of employees? Get your tissues out. It is heartbreaking. Wells Fargo paid a fine of $185 million without admitting or denying one fact or guilt by anyone, and not a single individual person was punished in connection with the settlement. Now, $185 million sounds like a lot of money, and it certainly would be to me or you. But consider this, Wells Fargo's revenue in the second quarter of this year was $22.2 billion. Its income for the second quarter, $5.6 billion. That's just 3 months. Its revenue for the year will probably be about $90 billion, and its income for the year will be about $20 billion. $185 million is pocket change to a bank that makes more than $20 billion. In fact, $185 million is less than 1% of what it will make in 2016. It's a very small cost of doing business. And remember, not one executive or supervisor was punished. In fact, let's be honest, just the opposite. They were rewarded. Numerous people at the bank get performance bonuses. Between 2012 and 2015, the top 5 executives at Wells Fargo received more than $450 million in performance pay, the top 5. The head of the business unit where all this criminal activity took place, who reported directly to the CEO, was allowed to retire, coincidentally and conveniently, in July, right before the settlement was announced. That person reportedly received a $125 million pay package going out the door, roughly equivalent to the $185 million fine. I mean, what's a couple tens of millions of people among friends? Think about that. How could Wells Fargo be treated so well when it stole money from many millions of its customers and when it stole many millions of dollars and ripped off more than 2 million customer accounts? The answer in part is due to a dysfunctional SEC that has lost its way, lost its focus, and lost sight of its real mission. In fact, too much of what we are seeing at Wells Fargo highlights and illustrates so much of what is wrong at the SEC and makes clear why it's so important to reinvigorate the SEC. What does Wells Fargo episode really tell us about the SEC? Well, first, unmistakably, the Wells Fargo scandal shows that Wall Street, big finance, and the country's biggest corporations don't fear or even respect the SEC. Now, it's not just the SEC. The other regulators are often not fair to respect it either. But the SEC is supposed to be the frontline cops on the corporate beat. That's their primary mission: enforce the law against corporations and their executives. But corporations and their executives don't fear the law, don't fear getting caught, and if caught, don't worry one bit about being meaningfully punished in their personal capacity. How could this be? Because an indefensible double standard has been created since the financial crash of 2008, when not one single executive or supervisor at a single too-big-to-fail bank was punished for any conduct at all leading up to the fraudulently inflated subprime bubble that caused the worst financial crash since 1929 and the worst economy since the Great Depression of the 1930s. Now remember, where did the SEC come from? It was created in the ashes of the Great Depression of the 1930s to make sure what happened in 2008 never happened. And think about what happened in 2008. We did a report, Better Markets did a report, showing that the crash of 2008, this is the report, the Cost of the Crisis report, that crash is going to cost this country more than $20 trillion with a T, trillion. That's $170,000 for every living woman, man, and child in the United States today. And not one major executive or supervisor in finance was punished. And since the 2008 crash, in scandal after scandal, illegal business practice after illegal business practice, not a single senior executive or supervisor at a too-big-to-fail bank on Wall Street has been punished. From illegally rigging virtually every single market in the globe, from LIBOR to foreign exchange, to the largest perjury conspiracy in the history of the country, euphemistically called robo-signing, because we can't say stealing and we can't say perjury. They have suits and ties and they sit behind desks and they don't hit you over the head. They just click away your money with you never knowing it. Robo-signing, they signed false affidavits, tens of thousands of them in this country, to take away people's homes in foreclosure proceedings. What happened there? Was one executive punished? Not one. No senior executives have been punished. They got to use shareholder money to pay fines while keeping their bonuses. This is referred to as too big to jail. What is the message that this sends to the corporate suites in America? It's unmistakable. Crime pays. What is the SEC's job? To make sure crime doesn't pay. Ending the double standard and putting the law back on Wall Street and back into the corporate boardrooms has to be a priority for all of us. The SEC simply must be respected and feared again, but that requires reinvigorating the SEC. There are a lot of other reasons, a lot of other lessons learned from the Wells Fargo episode as to the failings at the SEC, but let me jump to the question, why hasn't the SEC meaningfully punished executives and individuals? And by the way, why hasn't the SEC finalized the Dodd-Frank financial reform rules 6 years after the law was passed, mandating them to do it, including, tellingly and importantly, the clawback rule? Today, in the United States, there is not a single rule or law that requires the SEC or anybody else to claw back the money for performance money that was not otherwise earned. That's because they haven't finalized the rules. Well, the reason is because too often, not always, but too often, the SEC is a captured, paralyzed, politically abused agency. The SEC hears virtually only from industry, Wall Street, their lawyers, lobbyists, trade groups, and allies, including too many in Congress who are supposed to be your representatives. Together, they lay siege to the SEC day in and day out, fighting for rules and policies that advantage them. And often, Better Markets is the only organization fighting for the public interest against this industry onslaught. Not the only one. There's Public Citizen, AFR, the Consumer Federation of America, some unions, a few professors, and a couple others. But often, Better Markets is the only non-industry organization at the SEC opposing the industry. Now, let me be clear. It isn't everyone at the SEC who isn't doing their job. There are a lot of dedicated, talented, hardworking public servants at the SEC who go to work every day under difficult circumstances. But they lack political support, they lack outside support, and most fundamentally, they lack leadership, people who are fearlessly dedicated to protecting the public and promoting the public interest.